Hi guys, welcome or welcome back to my channel. My name is Vanessa, and from the title of this video you can already guess what we're talking about today. Today I'm going to be talking about everything interesting that I learned in my study of literature. For those of you who don't know, I am an English student and I eventually proceeded to do my master's in English literature. If you're new to my channel, if this is the first video that you're watching of me, you're welcome and I hope you do not make it your last. While I was studying literature in school, there were a lot of concepts that I wish that there had been someone on the internet like this who would break it down, especially using the Nigerian curriculum. I know that there's like a lot of people who do videos on literature, but some of those things might not actually be reflective of the topics that we study in school. I'm trying to be that person for other people who are still in school who would want this type of content. Obviously, this video is not going to be an all-encompassing video because it's just how many minutes, and how many minutes is not going to be able to reflect all the years and all the the knowledge that I've gathered over the years. So I guess let's begin. The first thing interesting that I learned was plot and the essence of plot to a good story. So from the time the word plot came into existence and by the time it was described by Aristotle and from then onwards, plot has basically been regarded to as the fragment upon which a story is hung. Some people define plot as an outline of events. However, in the early 20th century, an English novelist by the name E.M. Forster defined plot, and his definition of plot was that it was the necessary cause and effect relationship in a story. So taking this definition into consideration, it then became very obvious as to why this is the more acceptable definition of plot, because this definition basically differentiates between a story and a plot. So if you have been wondering what is the difference between a story and a plot, according to E.M. Forster's definition, a plot is a necessary cause and effect relationship. In the history of literary criticism, plot has undergone a variety of interpretation. In the Poetics, Aristotle assigned a primary importance to plot, which he described as the very soul of tragedy. It's also important for me to say here that Aristotle's definition of plot is character revealed by action. I want us to take a minute and just like step back and understand what he means by character revealed by action. It basically means that you know that in a story, they have different types of characters. You have round characters, you have flat characters, and the rest. However, for especially for round characters, the unraveling of a character is really dependent on how intentional the author is about the plot. However, as time progressed, even though Aristotle had accorded such high esteem to plot, the esteem that plot had generally began to diminish. Neo-Aristotelians, or Chicago School of Critics, following the leadership of the critic Ronald S. Crane, have described plot as the author's control of the reader's emotional responses, his arousal of the reader's interest and anxiety, and the careful control of that anxiety over a duration of time. This approach is only one of many attempts to restore plot to its former place of priority in fiction. The second thing that is interesting that I learned is how all the elements of a novel is actually important to the production of a good novel. So there is no one thing, or there's no one element of a novel that is more important than the other. It's just very striking to me that as I advance and I got to study literature more in-depthly, I got to see that every element of the novel, no matter how small you think it is. I mean, often people regard setting of a novel or maybe language of a novel as not really important. But the fact that in my years of study, I've come to understand that there are actually theories about this. There are theories about setting in fiction. There are theories about language in fiction. There are theories of characters in fiction. I mean, the basic ones we know are round and flat characters, but there's actually a lot of theories about other types of characters. How no element of fiction is negligible was really interesting to me and stood out. So for instance, in the novel Half of a Yellow Sun, it was set in the East. It was necessary that the story would be set in East to accurately reflect that the story was basically hinged on the backdrop of the Nigerian Civil War. So if the story were to be set elsewhere, then I really struggle to see how the message of the author would be passed in that way. In the same vein, there's also language. Every time that an author sets a story or sets a novel in a particular locale, so for instance, if a novel is set in the East, you'd see that there will be injections of phrases or proverbs or idioms in the Igbo language, and that's because everything basically has to tie together. So the sprinkling of poems, the sprinkling of idioms everything is actually done intentionally to further move the plot along. So there's actually nothing that is negligible in the construction of a novel or in the construction of a good story. Another thing that I learned that was very interesting is the influence of Aristotle and Plato to literature. In my final year, there was this question that we're asked to answer, which was explain the notion that all literary theories are a footnote to Plato and Aristotle. I've seen this question as a past question when I was revising for my final exams. And this question basically stood out to me, the fact that I still remember this question after how many years. And I thought about how influential these guys were, how influential Aristotle and Plato were, that several years down the line, everything that people write about in literature, every theory that is developed in literature always has a link to the classics. And by classics, I mean Aristotle and Plato in this regard. So starting from Aristotle, Aristotle's treatise, or really his theory, has really been described as descriptive, while Plato's theory has been described as prescriptive. Now, the reason that Aristotle is described as descriptive is because Aristotle talks about all the elements of a good play. Obviously, he had more preference of tragedy, and he talked a lot about what makes a good tragedy. So it's from Aristotle we began to hear things like catharsis. So Aristotle really described what would make a tragedy a good tragedy, what would make a good poem. While his theory was descriptive, Plato's theory was prescriptive, in the sense that he began to prescribe what poets should do and what they should not do. He really began to say, this is what your function is supposed to be. I declare that you need to be chased away from the Republic. So his was really prescriptive. So moving on quickly, the next thing that I learned that was very interesting was the divergence of views of Aristotle and Plato. And in this regard, I'm referring to what the function of a poet should be in the society. In Plato's argument, he argued that the poets, and by poets here, he means a writer, artist, that they should be banned from the Republic because they mislead man. So he leveled actually like so many counts, and one of those that he leveled was the fact that a poet was inspiring emotions in people, emotions in the citizens who were actually not supposed to have that emotion. So remember that Aristotle had basically described what would make a good tragedy. Obviously, it would mean that the prevalent form of fiction then was tragedy. Tragedy was accorded such high respect. It had the ability to move emotions, releasing catharsis, according to Aristotle. So you know that when you watch a good tragedy, you might start to get teary or you might start to get emotional. So in the words of Plato, people getting emotional from tragedy or from watching a good tragedy, which obviously was in the form of plays, but people get emotional from doing that would make them to be in tune with their emotions, which is bad. It would basically make them to be emotional, and it would eventually turn them to weaklings, which was not what Plato needed. For Plato, he regarded every citizen as a soldier, and soldiers are not supposed to have emotions. So tragedy was bad because it was corrupting the minds of the citizens. Another accusation that Plato had leveled against poets was the fact that they were reporting what was untrue. What they were reporting or what they were writing about was basically 3 times removed from reality. And Plato's theory was basically a search for metaphysical truth. So for instance, let's say that a poet is writing a poem or writing a story about a table, because in his theatres what he used was a table. So I'm also going to use that example. So if you're writing about a table, you are 3 times removed from reality, because first off, the carpenter has to make the table first. The true representation or the accurate representation of a table is metaphysical, because it has to come to us from the world of forms. That is one step. The table is in the world of forms. The carpenter gets the inspiration from the world of forms. The carpenter's table is a representation of the table in the world of forms. So it basically means that this table that we're seeing now might actually not really be what a table is in the world of forms. The table that we're seeing now can actually have more complexities, but it is being simplified because the carpenter has made a representation of it from the world of forms. When a poem goes to write about a table, That's like the third level. The poet is attempting to reflect what a table is in its poem, so it is 3 times removed from reality. Anyone that is not reporting the metaphysical level should actually be banished from society because you are not being accurate. Basically, you're not being authentic. Poets elicit emotions which should be kept at bay. Men should be soldiers and not show emotions. Women are solely for childbirth and domestic function, which is another video on its own entirely. Poetry should be utilitarian and not subversive. And also, I've said before, his pursuit for metaphysical truth. So another thing that I learned again is the 3 theories of drama. Remember that I said before that as I progressed through my years of study, I began to learn more about theory, just began to learn more in-depthly about all of these things that we gloss over in secondary school and maybe in like the first years of university. When I eventually got to do like my master's in these things, I began to understand. So the theories of drama in this regard would be romanticism, realism, and then surrealism. So what is romanticism? Romanticism was a broad intellectual movement that began in the 18th century. So when I was in my undergraduate days, when I heard the word romanticism, I basically thought that there were poets that wrote about romance, like they were basically romantic poets. They basically wrote about childhood, spontaneity, human nature, exalted nature. There was an intense focus on expressing human subjectivity, human passion, human emotion, and most of all, human imagination. There was this preponderance of favoring the human imagination over reason and over logic. So romantics often insist on artistic autonomy and fight to free the poet from the bondage of moral constraints. But romantics basically say that you should let your imagination run wild, do not be bounded by the constraints of morality and logic. Romantics often emphasize intense emotion as a more authentic source of human artistry, which is reflected in the definition of poetry by Wordsworth. If you remember, or if you've come across that definition, Wordsworth basically defines poetry as a spontaneous overflow of powerful emotions. So moving to the next theory of drama that I mentioned earlier, the second one I'll be talking about here is realism. And realism is a literary movement that represents reality by portraying the mundane, everyday parts of life in fiction. It seeks to tell the story of the common man as best as it can, without any elaborate structures or elaborate themes. It basically tells of the existence of man in society. So it basically seeks to tell the story of the common man as plain as it is, as bare as it is, without necessarily embellishing details of the common man's life. Writers that embrace realism would be Charles Dickens, George Eliot, which is represented in Silas Manner, and also Victor Hugo. Les Miserables is a French novel by Victor Hugo that basically criticizes how society treats members of the lower class. You see what I mean when I say that it is a very representation of reality, because even though this novel was written a long time ago, it is still something that is happening today. People who have been classified as people belonging to lower class tend to receive such maltreatment from the society, whether it be from people who are also in lower class with them or people who are in higher class. So it is actually an accurate representation of reality as it were then and as it is now. However, for George Eliot in her book Silas Manner, her principle of realism is the artistic pursuit of truth without necessarily pandering to the current social prejudices or trends that are obtainable as at the time of writing. This is accurately represented in the novel Silas Manner. The theory of realism is a theory that I find to be very fascinating because it cuts across all walks of life. Even in YouTube here, for instance, people are taking us on journeys of their personal lives, taking us on all these vlogs on how they spend everyday life. And there is something very enchanting about realism because people, they want to see all aspects of a human life, how normal humans live, without having to embellish any detail of that. Another thing that I'm going to talk about again is the theory of surrealism. And basically, surrealism is an attempt to bridge reality with the creative world or the creative imagination. Surrealism seeks to overcome the constraints placed on the imagination by the real world. So they create characters, events, occurrences that contradicts the law of physics, the law of gravity and stuff like that. An example that I have is the book that I've read of Emi Agoda. In this book, it is my opinion that the theory of surrealism is very evident in this book. This book is a compendium of short stories. I like to see when authors give themselves creative freedom to roam between their heads, to cross worlds in their heads, and to actually accurately represent that in print. So in this book, I see how characters do not obey the law of physics. One moment they are human beings, another moment they are transforming into other things, which is very like hooked on African culture. In our folk tales, in our customs, there is an intersection, there is a communication between the land of the spirits, the land of the dead, and the land of the living. It's very impressive to me when I read a book and I see how the author weaves between both worlds and accurately represents that on paper. So another thing that is essential that I need to mention is that the theory of surrealism was founded by Andre Breton, and this movement began in Paris and lasted until the 1940s. Also, another important component of this theory is the Freudian psychology, and with Freud's id and super id, where he basically talks about and examines the fact that there are different personalities in one person. This was a major influence in the development of the theory of surrealism. Another interesting thing that I learned about, this is now particular to African literature, but one interesting thing that I learned was the development, the history of drama in Nigeria. In 21st century that we are, it is obviously Nollywood in Nigeria. So how did we develop from the days of the old where we had other forms of entertainment? How did we develop from that time? What was the story from that time till now, where drama is now in the form of media and we consume that through our screen? In the development of this history, there are 4 phases that took us from the past to the present. The first phase would be the oral phase, or some people call it the traditional phase. Evidently, drama has actually always been native to Nigeria, even though theories of drama weren't propounded until much later. But it turns out that festivals are very native to Nigeria. I mean, every state in Nigeria has its own customs and traditions, and these customs and traditions usually include festivals where there is either the display of masquerade. So it can be said that drama originated from the celebration of festivals, display of masquerades, and also in rituals that were being performed across Nigeria. Ogumbi opines that whilst the specific origin of Nigerian theatre and drama are speculative, what is not speculative, however, is a robust theatrical experience in the societies within Nigeria. The primitive roots of that tradition, therefore, must be sought in the numerous religious ritual of festivals that exist in Nigerian communities. He also further communicates that Nigerian theatre and drama originated with the Nigerian himself, embodying his first preoccupations, his first struggles, successes, setbacks, and all. The first stage of Nigerian drama is with the Nigerian himself, reflecting in rituals, reflecting in the celebration of culture. So even though this view of drama, this view of the origin of drama is widely accepted, there are actually schools of thought who believe that even though they have some elements of drama, which would be spectacle, which would be language, which could be the presence of an audience, it necessarily doesn't mean that it can be called drama, because one, there is no plot to it. There's no cause and effect relationship displayed in these rituals that are being celebrated. Another reason why they don't consider this as an accurate representation of the evolution of drama is the fact that these are actually religious events. So religious events do not necessarily translate to drama. So the next stage in the evolution of Nigerian drama would be the traveling theater, and traveling theater is actually traced to the return of free slaves from America, and this return actually began in 1839. These freed slaves were joined by Brazilian immigrants to form the nucleus of the educated middle class. They also brought Western and European forms of concerts, and they settled mostly in Lagos, whose growing and expanding population was in dire need of entertainment and recreational facilities. So also, because of these events, it led Bishop Samuel Ajayi Crowther, Robert Campbell, and others to found the Academy in 1866, which was a social and cultural center for public enlightenment dedicated to the promotion of arts, science, and culture. Here, music and drama were performed. However, the audience was mostly an elite audience. By 1890, a conflict had developed in the church, which led the members of the church to break away. And because there was a breakaway from these churches and development of several other mushroom churches, it basically inspired the need for a church that was truly African in the real sense of being an African church. So this competition for converts led to the adoption of masquerade songs, which were reworked into church songs and then used to win converts. By this time also, the church had also started sponsoring drama in Nigeria. An example of such drama is King Leji Ejiho, which became the prototype of Yoruba traditional drama between 1902 and 1920. It was also in this era that Hubert Ogunde was born. So you recall that up to this time, the drama that was being watched, the drama that was being developed, were mostly pandering to the taste of the elite. Because again, remember that it originated from freed slaves who came from America. So obviously people who came from America, they brought with them Western and European forms of concept. It was pandering to the taste of the elite. So when Hubert Ogunde came into the scene, the trajectory of this changed, because then his first play, which was called Worse Than Crime, which was developed in 1945, presented colonialism as a system worse than crime. He also produced Strike and Hunger, which expressed the hopeless condition of labor in colonial Nigeria at the time. Of course, also his plays that were produced at that time were very reflective of the Nigerian experience and the Nigerian struggle, which was something that was lacking in the earlier versions of play that were being developed by the freed slaves. History also reported that Ogunde was the first one to launch a professional theatre company in Yoruba land, and he named this establishment the African Music Research Party in 1945. Previous performance groups were mass theatre groups called Alarinjo, who were dependent on the court or church for support and who also grew in popularity due to word of mouth. Hubert Ogunde's method of theatre was very distinguishable because he employed the use of advertisement and the use of promotion method, basically posters, and by changing the round stages used by the Alarinjo performers to one with a proscenium. Another reason why Hubert Ogunde's form of drama was different from the earlier practitioners was the fact that he introduced dramatic action into his plays, and he also introduced realism. Circling back to the original point I had made, where I said that his plays were very reflective of the average Nigerian experience. So through, infusing these elements, the use of advertisements, the changing of the round stages, introduction of dramatic action, his position as the proponent of modern traditional drama in Nigeria became solidified, and he actually remains the most influential practitioner when we begin to talk about the evolution or the development of modern drama in Nigeria. After the set of Hubert Ogunde and development of modern drama, the next set that led to the development of plays or the development of drama as it is now would be the generation of the Ibadan writers, as they were famously called. They were basically called the first generation of writers. Post-colonial drama culture shifted to Ibadan as early as 1960 among the university-based elitists, led by accomplished playwright and theatre practitioner Wole Soyinka of University of Ibadan, who was commissioned to write the nation's independence play, which he titled A Dance in the Forest. Other educated playwrights like J.P. Clark, Olarotimi arose at the same time, and then in 1960, Wole Soyinka formed a theatre called the Orison Theatre, and then another one called the 1960 Mass. Members of this club often posted open-air performances in which the plays like The Trials of Brother Jero, which was Wole Soyinka's play, and also The Song of the Goat, which was written by J.P. Clark. These open-air performances began to air by members of the club around this period in time. So by the 1970s, theatre and drama in Nigeria had become a household name. It wasn't really a strange concept anymore. Everyone was now introduced to the production of plays and the evolution of theatre and drama. The post-civil war in Nigeria saw the emergence of playwrights with socialist leanings, who included playwrights like Olarotimi, Bode Sowande, Olu Obafemi, amongst others. While the first generation of writers were interested in challenging the images and the stereotypes of Nigerians and Africans that were perpetuated by Western ideals, by the imperialist culture, the second generation of writers were writing highly critical literature, and they seemed to be more concerned with events happening in contemporary Nigeria and to also reflect those events in their works. Because the period they were writing in was the post-civil war, a lot of the literature that they wrote were highly influenced by the Civil War, and they sought to comment on the reality, as it were. The second generation include plays like Tunde Fatunde's No More Oil Boom and Organa Tifman, Femi Oshofison's The Chattering and the Song, Bode Sowande's A Sanctus for Women, Neo Shundare's Songs of the Marketplace. The second generation of writers were influenced by the Civil War and the state of the country at the time, which obviously was a very corrupt era. The literature at that time heavily reflected how corrupt they reflected the realistic nature. So after this period, the next stage in the emergence of modern drama would be the rise of Nollywood. Before I start, I need to state that the rise of Nollywood was heavily inspired by economic recession at the time. In 1992, 1992, a movie produced by Ken Nibwe, which was titled Living in Bondage, was produced. The film basically tells the story of a man who signs a pact with the devil to get rich and portrays the practices of witch doctors and the desperation of their client. It was a big hit and a genre called Juju emerged. This film suggests that a lot of the wealth of Nigerians' new rich came from diabolical means that resonated in a society of pervasive inequality. So remember that earlier I said that a lot of the productions, a lot of the literary productions of Africans is usually inspired by African folklore and the world of the spirit, which is reflected in Living in Bondage because it portrays the communication of the spirit world in the form of witchcraft, in the form of rituals, in the form of sacrifices, and then the effect of that is carried over into the physical world, which would reflect in the form of ritual money. So there is a high dependence on African traditions in the production of literature. A little history is that Nigerians actually began making movies on their own during the oil boom of the 70s. However, it kind of took a downturn because of the economic recession at that time. Paradoxically, that was when Nollywood took off. So by the 1990s, the once vibrant film theater scenes declined, and also at this time, sitting on celluloid had become unaffordable. Okay, so that was that about the theory of drama and the evolution of drama from the oral period to Nollywood as we know it today. And then even from Nollywood, we can now start to talk about social media and then skits and the development of skits and all of that. The next thing that was interesting for me to learn about was the concept of intertextuality, and this is a concept that was popularized by Julia Kristeva. It basically means that no text is a standalone. In simpler terms, it means that everything is influenced by everything. Life is a circle of events constantly influencing one another. For instance, this context which we're talking about would be literature, but all the things, the element of literature, everything generally is basically influenced by life itself, which goes back to the theory of realism that I talked about before. But more specifically now, I'm referring to African literature because remember I said earlier that African literature is greatly influenced by our folklore, our traditions, our rituals. And in a great deal of African literature, we noticed a preponderance of usage of, you can see, manifestations of the usage of folklore, of idioms, phrases, African proverbs, songs. And that's because a great deal of African literature is inspired by our oral tradition. This also links back to the theory of realism. You cannot separate African literature from African oral tradition because even when African writers are writing prose, and by prose here I mean novels, even when they're writing novels, you can see that they still go back to the usage of songs. Example of this can be seen in Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart. It can also be seen in Half of a Yellow Sun and so many other books. That's just because African literature is regarded as having a communal belonging. Usually, African literature is classified as being owned by the community rather than by a single person because it is usually reflective of the African oral tradition. The theory of intertextuality just says that everything inspires everything. I mean, looking even at the origin of literature in Nigeria, a lot of it is influenced either by colonial events or the colonial status of the country, and then it's also influenced by civil war. So everything is intertwined together. African literature is inextricable from life. Another thing that I learned that was very interesting to me is the novel in Africa. Most of the time, writers of African novel break away or deviate from Western ideals of what a novel should be. This also goes back to my earlier point where I said that African authors, even if they're writing novels, you can see instances or infusions, things that are supposed to be in plays, for instance, or things that are supposed to be in poems. You see infusion of that in African novels, and that's because the African novel is again reflective of the African experience, and African experience is highly oral. A lot of the stories, tales under the moonlight. And also this is heavily seen in the first African novel, which was The Palm Wine Drinkard by Amos Tutuola. In that novel, you can see a standard deviation from what a classical novel, a classical prose is supposed to be. So African novel is inspired by the need to be original, by the need to reflect the authentic African experience. While I was studying this course, I had to learn about the evolution of print media in Nigeria, and then the first printed novel or the first printed text in Nigeria, which is Segilola, and then also the one that I referenced earlier, which would be The Palm Wine Drinkard. But like really learning about these books, these are not books that on a normal day, if I didn't study literature, I would have known about. Beyond being a means of entertainment, they actually lend themselves to being a tool of colonial resistance, because for you to actually be able to resist colonialism, you have to be able to tell your story. You cannot leave your stories to be told by strangers or by foreigners. So the next interesting thing that I learned about is actually one of my most favorite parts of studying literature, which is basically the theory of post-colonialism and also mimicry. Mimicry is a byproduct of post-colonialism. What is post-colonialism? Post-colonialism is actually a theory that looks at how countries who have been victims of colonialism, how their literature reflects that experience. Postcolonialism is a whole theory which was propounded by theorists such as Edward Said, Homi K. Baba, Frantz Fanon, Albert Memmi. These people have theories, have papers, books written on post-colonialism. So I really encourage you to go and just get more educated about it. So Frantz Fanon has written a lot about post-colonialism. He says that mimicry is a necessary effect of colonialism because the people who have now been colonized now have an inferior identity about themselves. The African writers who write post-colonial work, they are interested in portraying a vivid picture of Africans as not only creative people but also as intelligent people. I'm going to again make reference to Things Fall Apart, because Things Fall Apart is a book written to the center. By written to the center, I mean written to the imperialist thinking, the imperialist ideology that the advent of colonialism brought order, brought system to the country. There is a clear intention by Chinua Achebe to basically talk about systems and traditions that were already existent in those societies. But also because for the longest time, the people's original identity has been derailed. You now see that people begin, for instance, to try to mimic the appearance of the colonizer, which, mimicking in terms of dressing, in terms of appearance, in terms of even skin color. As someone who does content of skincare and as someone who lives in Nigeria, I see this heavy preponderance for people to want to be light skinned, for people to want to bleach their skin. And bleaching actually is a side effect of post-colonialism, because again, you want to have the appearance of your oppressor, you want to have the appearance of the colonial masters, just because if you can at least attain their color of your skin, maybe it can make you to be more powerful. So mimicry is something that even still happens till today, even though colonialism has said to have ended long ago, but mimicry still pervades today, because again, even though in theory we now have our independence, but again, do we really have our independence? And there's a whole theory talking about how post-colonial states are now faring in the light of independence. Are they really independent, considering the fact that these people still want to mimic, still want to copy the colonial masters? And by mimicry here, I just realized that I did not explain what mimicry is. By mimicry here, I basically just means you want to mimic, you want to copy. And Homi K. Baba is actually the one that popularized the theory of mimicry, where he says that mimicry is copying, and there's actually an ambivalent relationship between people who practice mimicry, because there's a love-hate relationship. You are loving, the fact that you have to copy these people, you are trying so hard to attain to this level, to this standard that they have set for you. But again, you also know that the reason that you're wanting to copy these people so much is because you hate yourself, or because you hate what you were born with. So in this instance, it would be hating the color of your skin, hating the texture of your hair, and also now going into body dysmorphia, where people now want to have slimmer bodies and thinner bodies. Mimicry really questions the idea that our country is really free from independence, considering the fact that mimicry is still something that is practiced still today. So that is a question that is still being resolved. Another thing that I learned in my course of study would be African literature as a tool of resistance, and by this instance I mean African poems, African authors, and some of them would refer to Dennis Brutus, Chinua Achebe, and the rest of them. African literature generally is a tool of resistance, and by tool of resistance I mean resistance in the face of colonial power, trying to reassert oneself in the light of all the debilitating things that have been written about Africans. I had to learn about poets like Denis Brutus, Leopold Sedar Senghor, which was a Senegalese president. I also had to learn about Okot P. Bitek, Kofi Ayidoho, J.P. Clark, amongst others. In the case of Denis Brutus, we had to study a number of his poems, and a recurring theme in his poems. Obviously, Denis Brutus is a South African poet, but a recurring theme is that he used his poems as a tool of resistance and fighting the war, speaking up about it, which is something that I really admire and I really like about literature, is the fact that it is supposed to reflect life and it's supposed to reflect the prevailing sensibilities at the time. And I just like the fact that people turn to their pens and turn to, literature to convey the message that they would not otherwise have conveyed. But Denis Brutus was able to tap into, his artistic sensibilities, and he wrote about activism. Because of that, he was jailed a number of times and he was heavily persecuted at the time. His first collection of poetry, which is Sirens, Knuckles and Boots, was published in 1963, and it was actually published in Nigeria while he was in prison. But going through this poetry, I love the fact that it's titled Sirens, Knuckles and Boots, because it reflects what the poem is about to be. And knuckles and boots, and just a prevailing sense of doom and gloom. Just learning about this African poets kind of widened my horizon. I was someone that I didn't really like poems, I don't know why. I know that a number of Nigerian students don't actually also like poems as well. I don't know if it's something that has to deal with foundation, that has to deal with how we were introduced to poems. But now with studying this course, it just kind of widened my horizon on poems and also the essence of poems to literature as a whole. Now, a bonus point that I have is the language question, which is something that is a point of difference for authors and theories of African origin. The language question is asking that because we are writing against the colonial experience, how are we supposed to reflect that? Are we supposed to still use English, which is the language of colonialism? Are we supposed to use the language of these people to reflect the accurate Nigerian experience? And Wole Soyinka, Chinua Achebe, and people who were also at the conference at the time, it was a point that they did not really agree on. The critic Obiwali published an article called "The Dead End of African Literature" is linked also in the description box. He argued that an African writer who thinks and feels in his own language must write in that language. English was simply incapable of being able to carry the African experience. But then in the viewpoint of Chinua Achebe, he has said that the English language is what he has been given, and he's going to make the English language to bear the sensibilities that he wants to convey. He's going to use the English language to convey the African experience to the best of his abilities. But also for other authors such as Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who at the time he even disagreed that he should be writing in English. He believed that English is not enough to convey the African experience, and so he should use his native language, which he actually started doing after some time. So the language question is, a question again that several authors disagree on because of the reasons that I've just mentioned above. I think that is all. That's everything interesting that I learned in my course of study. I do hope that I was able to convey this interest to you, and I do hope that I was able to get your interest at least picked to go and learn more about this. If there is any topic that I touched on but I didn't really go in depth and you want an in-depth video, please just let me know in the comment section and I'll be glad to make a video about that in the future. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for staying tuned, and I'll see you in my next one. Bye.